Good evening and welcome to the Canadian Embassy. Bienvenue à l'ambassade du Canada. My name is Carolyn Strauss and I'm the Cultural Counselor, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here this evening. We are absolutely delighted that you're honoring Dean Stern by hosting the 2008 Vincent Scully Prize lecture. We are well aware of the phenomenon described by Rodgers and Hart in 1938 as singing for your supper. Songbirds always eat if their song is sweet to hear. While we can't actually offer Dean Stern a meal tonight, we hope our applause after the lecture will serve instead. Canadians in Washington feel a special affinity with the National Building Museum and its programs celebrating architectural innovation and exemplary urban design. The museum has been assiduous in forging strong connections with Canada. For example, of the 10 Vincent Scully Prizes awarded, there were 3 to Canadians: author and urban planning pioneer Jane Jacobs, Phyllis Lambert, founder of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and author and urban planning professor who is with us this evening, Witold Rybczynski. Moreover, Moishe Safdie has spoken about his work twice at the museum as part of the premier lecture series called Spotlight on Design. This September, the former Vancouver Director of Planning, Larry Beasley, discussed the importance of urban planning and sustainable cities. And the Canadian architect Bing Tom recently gave a presentation at the museum about his new designs for Arena Stage in Southwest Washington, which is 1 block from where I live. Let me offer a footnote about this building by Arthur Erickson. We all know about the clash between money and aesthetics and between commerce and learning, and how architecture can sometimes meld and transcend both. You may be interested to know that Erickson's new embassy replaced both a Ford car dealership and a public library. And now I am delighted to welcome Chase Rind, President and Executive Director of the National Building Museum. Good evening.
Thank you, Carolyn. It is such a pleasure to be here at the Canadian Embassy tonight, and we are very grateful for your hospitality. The National Building Museum is proud to have celebrated many Canadian contributions within the built environment. And as Carolyn noted, the Vincent Scully Prize jury has done a terrific job in recognizing some of the great Canadians who have enhanced the quality of our places through their advocacy, their scholarship, their teaching, and their practice. As the cultural institution for the building arts and sciences in the United States, advancing the quality of the built environment is our mission. For nearly 30 years, we have educated literally millions of people and raised public awareness about the vast historic, social, and cultural issues that shape our buildings, structures, communities, and cities. Our exhibitions, our school programs, lectures, and publications offer inspiration to the youngest of children up to the most educated professional. The Scully Prize Lecture is an instrumental part of how we build public knowledge and appreciation. In the late 1990s, David M. Schwarz, President and CEO of David M. Schwarz Architects, Inc., had a vision for a prize that would recognize the ideas and the values Professor Vincent Scully shared with generations of students, colleagues, and readers. David worked with the museum to establish a prize in his former professor's name and suggested that an original lecture be presented by each laureate. These lectures have become a hallmark of the prize, some of the greatest teachers, scholars, and advocates in architecture, design, and planning sharing their thoughts about our world. We sincerely have David to thank for his great vision for the prize and the lecture, as the past 9, and surely tonight's, have given us extraordinary moments, critical reflection, and new perspectives. And on that note, please join me in welcoming David Schwarz to the podium.
You know, it's interesting. The Building Museum gave me a script, as they generally tend to do, and they didn't tell me that most of the people speaking before me were going to say the same things that they wanted me to say. So I'm going to have to wing it. But basically, we are greatly indebted to the Canadian Embassy for having hosted a whole series of events for us and having provided us with 3 of our most exemplary laureates. All of our laureates are exemplary. The Vincent Scully Prize was originated about 10 years ago, and it was both to commemorate Vince's extraordinary contribution to the intellectual appetite for the built environment and to encourage other people to follow in his stead. It was my view at the time that we build a lot, but we don't talk about it nearly as much as we ought. That a more educated populace would demand better cities, better places to live. When I was in architecture school, the lesson they tried to teach us was that, the market rules, the market gets what it wants. And I learned over time that no, in fact, it's not the market that rules, it's developers who rule. And that, in fact, people buy what they can rather than what they want. And Vince has actually helped us to understand that what we want makes a difference. The humanity with which we build, the humanity with which we plan our cities, the humanity with which we design our built environment is a reflection of our very own humanity, and how we choose to leave the world is a symbol to our children of what we viewed as being important. Given that, it's entirely appropriate that Robert A.M. Stern should be our 10th laureate. Bob has done a phenomenal job as an educator and a teacher. He was the head of the preservation department at Columbia University. As well, he has done a wonderful job reinvigorating the Yale School of Architecture and brought people from all different stripes and styles to the school. Bob is ecumenical in his view of architecture, and in today's world where most purists are arguing that they have the one truth, having somebody who expresses the notion that there are many truths is critical to vibrant and important dialogue. As well, Bob is a phenomenal architectural historian. He has written clearly the definitive work on New York. He's published many articles. He's fought for the preservation of a great many landmarks across the country, and particularly in New York. We owe him for raising the issue of the preservation of classic modernism of the 50s and 60s. Without him, it never would have occurred. And he has brought many issues of great importance for our consideration over the course of his storied career. There's nobody better to speak a few words about Bob than Vince Scully, though Bob doesn't look as old as Vince. In ways, they've known each other for what in Bob's life is forever. In Vince's life, is just a blink of an eye. But Bob told us last night that he studied under Vince 48 years ago, and that's quite impressive. Neither of them would seem that that was possible. Either that Bob could have been a student or that Vince could have been a teacher. So it is my pleasure to welcome Vince Scully to the stage. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in the Canadian Embassy in Ericsson's spectacular, columned and gleaming building, which I always find very stimulating. It's also been a great pleasure to see Bob Stern honored here in Washington as he deserves to be. He's, after all, uniquely many-sided and multi-talented, not only as an architect, but also as a distinguished historian, critic, teacher, and superlative dean of the Yale Architecture School. And I gather it is Bob as educator and dean who is addressing us tonight. This is fitting because I suspect the deanship at Yale has represented for Bob the crowning jewel of his career. Though an undergraduate at Columbia, appropriate for such a lover of New York, who became its greatest chronicler architecturally, Bob became a loyal Yalie as well when he came to us as a graduate student in the early 1960s, and where he became one of my best students and a lifelong friend. When President Levin had the great good sense to offer him the deanship of the school in 1997, some members of the faculty objected that his office in New York was so enormous that he would never be able to spend enough time in New Haven. But Bob, by some mystical process, proved them all dead wrong, because he is now always in New York and always in New Haven. It's a true natural phenomenon. And he has made the Yale School one of the most important centers existing today for that international conversation about architecture, without which intelligent architecture and urbanism cannot flourish. Every shade of opinion is welcome, because Bob can handle them all. Nobody I know is more qualified to speak about architectural education than Bob, and I look forward eagerly to hearing tonight. Thank you, Councillor Strauss, Chase Friend, David Schwartz, and most of all, thank you, Vince. As I said last night, and I hesitate, but I am going to repeat, I am deeply touched by this award, unquestionably the greatest honor available to those of us who endeavor to pursue a scholarly practice of architecture. And I'm hugely flattered to be in the distinguished company of the previous Scully laureates, Shirley and Auguste Group, and I know that Vito Brzezinski among them is in this room, for which I am grateful. The Scully Prize is very important because, unlike other prizes that are for design achievements, this one recognizes the interdisciplinary achievements of people in architecture who may or may not be architects. They don't even have to be Canadian. Most of all, I'm honored to be introduced by the man to whose immense accomplishments this prize is dedicated, Vincent Scully, my teacher, my mentor, and friend. One thing is clear, I would not be standing here before you as the 10th Scully Prize laureate were it not for Vincent Scully, and all he has taught me over 48 years of time. Professor Scully's erudition, his commitment to excellence, his passion for architecture as a social art, inspired me as a student and continues to do so today. Vincent Scully sets a standard to which I will always aspire. Although it would have been easy for me to talk about my work as an architect or as a historian, the prize committee, or its spokespeople, they're now running for cover everywhere, gave me a tougher assignment and asked that I talk about architectural education today. Surely this is a topic of importance. It's also one that too often devolves into high-minded windiness. I'll try to be direct, reasonably brief, I'm not sure about that, and not too windy. However, I may use a little bit of thunder and lightning to liven up the proceedings as we go along. The longer I've been an architectural educator, the more I've come to realize that in a certain basic way, the making of architecture cannot be taught, but that students can learn about what architecture has been and is at any given moment. However, prodded by the Scully Prize Committee, I've attempted to frame what might be described as an educational scaffold for the next generation of architects who will take their place in a world of work that is proving to be dramatically different from the world many of us in this audience grew up in. And every day it gets more and more different. At its most basic, the purpose of education is to help a student find his or her way in a discipline. In architecture, this is certainly the case, but as the German emigre architect Mies van der Rohe put it when he became director of the Illinois Institute of Technology in 1938, real education, and I'm quoting, must transcend practicality and go on to mold personality. Thus, education for architecture is not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance. A school of architecture must develop a technical competency at the university level for which, generally speaking, and this is one of the great ironies, students are none prepared for by prior education. Every other graduate study that a student undertakes in a university, usually they've been prepared for in high school and college. Most architecture students arrive at the first day of architecture school, whether at undergraduate or graduate level, totally unprepared except for romantic notions, usually fostered by Ayn Rand and others. It's a pretty good movie, but it's not the real way it goes. But it must do so, that is, a school must do so without neglecting humanistic values. Put another way, architecture is an applied science, but it's also an art like no other, a public art, a social art that carries with it the responsibility to give physical shape to hopes and dreams for a better life. Thus, although architectural education should prepare students for making a living, it should also prepare them for positively affecting the lives of others. Our role as teachers is to give students the tools to pursue the craft of architecture
and the confidence to release their individual talents. But as we prepare students for the rough and tumble of the so-called real world, we must also help our students develop frameworks for critical thinking. Again, quoting Mies, as he put it, education must lead us from irresponsible opinion to responsible judgment. It must lead us from chance and arbitrariness to rational clarity and intellectual order. In other words, architectural education must provide young architects and architects throughout their lives with a theoretical basis on which to proceed as they confront the prospects of the future. A theory of architecture, yes, but one that grows from the discipline itself, not one that is imposed upon it. Technique and scholarship must be combined to foster independent critical thinking. Finding the answers to specific problems does matter, but it is not the end point of education. Learning how to search for answers, on the other hand, is the highest goal for each of us, students and teachers alike. Too much architectural education is governed by a priori conceptions of what architecture is or ought to be. Too much architectural education is circumscribed, I might even say hidebound, by whatever is currently fashionable, both in styles of designing and in styles of thinking. Paul Rudolph, my teacher in the studio, believed that the role of the teacher is, quote, to talk only in terms of principles, which really don't change, end quote. Principles, Rudolph said, are, quote, not formulas, end quote, but are the sounding boards or guideposts, the theory, as it were, of practice. And it is the obligation of a teacher to bring these principles to life. As an architectural I should parenthetically say we had a wonderful event this weekend in New Haven celebrating the rededication of Rudolph Hall, and many graduates who are important architects in the world today came and talked, and they only talked about Rudolph no matter what we asked them to talk about. That was what they had on their minds. And they were all men, to a man, they all said what an amazing teacher was, and first and foremost, he never told you what he wanted to do with your project. He wanted you to know what, he tried to figure out what you wanted to do with your project. Most teachers don't have that strength. As an architectural educator with a long career of university teaching, I have done my level best to carry forward the open-mindedness of my own education under Vincent Scully and Paul Rudolph, who, as I saw it in my student days and still see it, shared the conviction that if architecture was to speak to new possibilities, it must revere the principles that underpinned the great accomplishments of the past. In my student days, Paul Rudolph vigorously opposed the then dominant belief in the profession that modern architecture was not only singular in its formal expression, but also disconnected from what went before it. Rudolph believed in the continuity of the past and the present, and he did not believe that the modern world demanded or deserved a singular mode of expression. He reveled in the clash of ideas, and at Yale he saw himself as captain of an educational vessel that sailed the various waters of contemporary practice. He saw to it that the studios were led by strong but dissident personalities, ranging from Jim Sterling to Serge Chemaev to Robert Venturi, to name but a few who taught in my days in the university in the early 1960s. Rudolph's Yale forms the basis of what I believe architectural education should be. An architecture school is not a schooling ground for geniuses or wannabe geniuses. An architectural school is an environment where people of intelligence and talent are introduced to the many ways one can be creative in the field, both at the cutting edge of avant-gardism and within the heritage of tradition, where established languages of form that carry deep cultural roots can be deployed to meet new needs and retooled to say new things. For too long, architectural education has indulged in narcissistic formalism and a priori schema passed off as theories. Architectural education is not a rite of ideological initiation. It is a rite of passage into the murky waters of contradictory choices. Architectural education must be an invitation to learning, but with one central purpose: to help young architects discover their own way. And what better way to discover oneself than by the exploration of what is already known in all its complexity? Far less productive are attempts to anticipate or outguess the future, which almost always does not take the shape any of us, in or out of the academy, would wish. Though architecture is rooted in technical problem solving, it achieves its glory through the celebration of the spirit. As such, it belongs to the liberal arts tradition. Consequently, I believe architecture schools are best situated in liberal arts research universities, which require of students what the poet Guillaume Apollinaire called, quote, that long quarrel between order and adventure. A quarrel, I would say, that cannot be resolved, nor should it be. The quarrel itself is the great teacher. So to turn to specifics, I believe architectural education must begin with the history of the discipline itself. The study of history forces us to confront Apollinaire's great quarrel between order and adventure. While some bits and pieces of the history of architecture are required to be taught in our schools as of the moment, history as a way of thinking is typically confined to its own realm and demeaned in the design studio, where too often today the studio discourse is limited to the available possibilities on the contemporary horizon. In direct opposition to his teacher, the belligerently anti-traditional Walter Gropius, Paul Rudolph insisted that the great accomplishments of the past bear witness to the pretensions of contemporary work. He once said modern architecture ran the gamut of emotions from A to B. The past must be part of the design process, not as nostalgia for a lost ideal, but as a clarifying, stabilizing referent for present action. In embracing this view of history as part of the design process, I take pleasure in knowing that an esteemed colleague at Harvard, the educator and architect Raphael Moneo, shares it as well. In our fast-paced, media-besotted modernity, Moneo writes, the past may well represent, quote, the only sensation of reality left in architecture. The world of images provided by history, I'm quoting him still, is the only sensible reality that has not been destroyed by scientific knowledge or by society. The past, Moneo continues, has a memorial authority. The past is life's witness. That too many architecture schools neglect the past as part of their design curriculum is just plain irresponsible. The past is not something dead and dusty to be avoided or confined to trivializing classroom surveys. For the student architect, and indeed for every architect, the past must be an essential provocation to action in the present. As the troubled character Mary in Eugene O'Neill's play Long Day's Journey into Night puts it, the past is present, isn't it? We all try to lie out of that, but life won't let us. While architectural education needs to renew its connections to architectural history, it's not nearly enough to convey the facts and dates and big stylistic concepts to our students. The entire enterprise of architectural history needs to be reconsidered so that our cross-cultural trends are emphasized. And of course, I'm not speaking about Vincent Scully. He never did any of these bad things, I can assure you. I am using his model as the basis of a reform in the discipline. The cross-cultural trends are emphasized in place of the narrow silos of styles and periods that still hobble too many curricula. And the age-old idea that history provides students with models for behavior, and in the case of architectural students, models for their creative work, must not be decried, as has been the case for too long, but celebrated. Mimicry remains one of the great strategies of education in architecture, as in the arts and indeed in life itself. How would we be ourselves if we didn't imitate our parents, for better or for worse? It takes us a long time to get over that, some of us, but that's the way you learn. History has its complement, the theory of architecture, by which I do not refer to the many extra architectural isms that have distracted the Architectural Academy for the past 30 years or so. Theory of architecture is, as Peter Eisenman has put it, the discipline that must undergird the performance of design itself. That is what Paul Rudolph meant when, on assuming leadership in architecture at Yale 50 years ago, he lamented the situation in which action had outstripped theory. Theory, he insisted, must overtake action again. That is also what Aldo Rossi meant in his 1966 inaugural address as head of the Venice Architecture School, when he stated that the purpose of architectural education is to develop a theory of practice. For too long, architecture has been considered by its theorists as little more than a cultural barometer, a verification of the zeitgeist. Architecture and its pedagogy have been trapped by a tyranny of timeliness, a terrorism that trivializes the building art. When I speak of the need for an architecture rooted in theory, I want to be clear that I am not thinking of that futile search for pure ideas sundered from the realities of tectonics of politics and economics. That kind of theory has plagued the academy for a generation, with some proclaiming architecture to be autonomous and others declaring it the reification of verbal strategies devised by literary critics. For too long, some of our most prominent architecture schools were places where the principal thrust of the curriculum was to subvert the art and indeed the very act of building. This has had a disastrous impact on the status of architectural education as a whole. Architecture cannot be served by an educational model removed from the inherent materiality of the building art. Rhetoric cannot replace technique. I'll find it, don't go away. For me, the fundamental theory of architecture lies in the classical tradition. To enter into the classical tradition is to enter into the etymology of architectural form. That's what you get for revising slightly before. To release architecture from circumstantial action into realms of meaning rooted in the enduring natural order of the world. An architectural education must be rooted in its own long history and in its unavoidable materiality. The young architect should be prepared to tackle the myriad circumstances of contemporary practice, however. As never before, architects must be culturally nimble. No longer can today's architect afford the luxury of a blinkered modernism. Today's architect must be cosmopolitan in approach to form. Those who only know a few things are more than ever before at their peril in the minefields of global practice. The modernist mindset that still dominates architectural education presents a virtually insurmountable obstacle to meaningful attempts to embrace the cosmopolitanism that global practice demands. Let me be clear about the term modernism, at least as I see it. Modernism is an ideology that embraces an unquestioning faith in functional problem solving and technological progress as the generative basis for the physical constructs we call buildings. Modernism is a self-limiting mindset. Modernism is a style. Modernism is an attitude that in its very essence, modernity rather, is an attitude that in its very essence is cosmopolitan. An attitude that allows for freedom of choice. To be cosmopolitan is to be modern and to reject absolutes. Modernism is a subset of modernity. Unlike modernism, modernity has no singular ideology. Modernism, the ideology, wraps architecture in a cocoon of purity. Modernity, on the other hand, opens it up to the various circumstances of the present. Modernism blinkers our view. Modernity opens us up to the world as it is. One of the great responsibilities of education in architecture is to relieve the beginning student of his hunger for simple answers as he or she conquers the daunting challenges of entering a creative field, a world of creativity in a field which, as I pointed out before, at a comparatively advanced age, he or she is inclined to have had no previous preparation. The facile way to make this responsibility is to give the beginning student a single way of doing things, not principles, but purifying strategies that restrict choice. That is the way which has for too long dominated architectural pedagogy. But the facile way, I believe, is not the right way. The way of the modern world is opposite to self-limiting purifying strategies. The modern world is filled with a plethora of choices. Today's is an interconnected world previously unimagined, which is also a cliche, I apologize. Among many I've probably mouthed, that's about the worst. Bringing with it cultural hybridity that flies in the face of the modernist faith in universals. Cultural hybridity relies on the contamination of ideas, which the Princeton philosopher, for Yale Dean to even mention that university is pretty good, Princeton philosopher K. Anthony Appiah describes as, quote, the endless process of imitation and revision, end quote. To meet the requirements of heterogeneous culture, today's students need to embrace the cultural hybridity that aesthetic polemicists of 100 years ago fought and feared. We must help today's students to explore the seemingly contradictory points of view of tradition and modernity, and to see them not as contradictory choices, but as profoundly reasoned and parallel ways to shape the world. We must help our students to be cosmopolitan. Some might argue that cosmopolitanism implies a lack of commitment, that it is a kind of intellectual and artistic promiscuity. But as Appiah has written, a true cosmopolitan understands that, quote, there are many values worth living by, and you cannot live by them all, end of quote. A cosmopolitan recognizes that knowledge is, quote, imperfect, provisional, subject to revision in the face of new evidence, end quote. To use the distinction between the hedgehog and the fox that was made famous by Sir Isaiah Berlin, the modernist hedgehog knows only one thing, but the modern cosmopolitan, he or she is the fox, who knows many things, including those that are traditional and those that are modern. Cosmopolitanism, Appiah notes, is universality plus difference. Cosmopolitan is based on the competition of ideas. To serve the needs of our time of global exchange, more than ever before, education must have as its basis a passionate commitment to the cosmopolitan competition of ideas. When everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks very much. As I said at the outset of this talk, architecture is a professional practice and an art. And the principal role of schools is to prepare students for professional competence that can help pave their way to artistic and professional success. So saying, any discussion of architectural education cannot avoid consideration of certain systemic changes that have recently come about in how architects approach their core work. In particular, we cannot ignore the fact that digitized electronics has transformed practice and has dramatically insinuated itself into all aspects of architectural education, most especially calling into question the age-old ways that beginning architects have historically used to develop their insights into the geometries of form and the representation of design ideas. Today's typical student enters the study of architecture largely through a virtual world, not through a systematic examination of physical relationships. Today, one rarely sees a parallel rule or a roll of tracing paper on a student's desk. T-squares, triangles, French curves, and other tools that were the stock in trade of architects for hundreds of years are not only no longer in use, but also not even recognizable by very many young designers. They don't know what a slide rule is, by the way. I'm not sure that's lost, but there you go. Instead, computers abound, not only for information gathering, written communication, and ordinary drafting, but also for the shaping of form, for initiating design. The screen dominates the student's world. As a result, our students are distant from dimensions, issues of dimension, heft, tactility, materiality, and countless other similar aspects of traditional architectural form, which no matter how much electronic media can help us, remain essential to architecture as built environment. I welcome the introduction of digital techniques into practice and into education for practice. But in welcoming the digital media, I do not condone the abandonment of all that went before. If we abandon hand drawing and model making, if students are no longer asked to represent shades and shadows, to explore descriptive geometry, to learn how to sketch and see what they see in the real world, in fact, to copy what they see in the real world, they will be allowed to do so at the peril of losing touch with the very physical nature of architecture itself. The computer distances the designer from direct observation of the world. 75 years ago, Le Corbusier raged against architects with eyes that do not see. The computer produces architects with eyes that not only do not see, but have very little idea of how to look. Hand drawing requires the eye to look very hard at what is seen. Drawing is hard. Commanding a predetermined software application is not. Today's students may know how to render with Rhino, but they often don't know how big a brick is, what the proportion of treads to risers need to be, and countless other things that only direct hands-on experience can introduce them to. To this extent, I believe drawing is the basis of architectural education. The headlong rush to electronic computation, where the student typically manipulates pre-established patterns and images, threatens to cut the profession off from its own self-criticality and from its own creativity. To draw is to analyze. Unless we are vigilant, the age-old process of drawing, a process still cherished by our fellow painters and sculptors, will disappear from the practice of architecture, and at considerable peril to the quality of what we have chosen to do. As much as the computer presents us with opportunity, it also presents us with problems. But there is no sweeping the computer under the rug. Part of the problem, however, lies with architects seizing the computer as a way to increase efficiency, and with architects a propensity to embrace the new thing with not much soul searching. In other words, architects went to the computer thinking it would make them more profitable. It would reduce time, increase fees. In fact, it only meant that they had to hire more IT people and outsource this stuff to people in India or China. But naively, we moved on without asking any questions. Architects need to conquer their immature relationship with technology, which they tend to see as a series of replacements for traditional ways of doing things, rather than as enhancements of their capacity to create. Schools need to encourage students to get comfortable with the computer as a companion to hand drawing, not as a replacement for it. Computers are tools. As such, they are only as good as those who operate them. Creativity lies in the designer, not in the software. The mind-hand connection is still crucial to the creative process and to craft. To prepare architects for the global practice they are likely to encounter, education must be taken out of the classroom and into the field as never before. Travel opens the doors of perception and expectation. It heightens the sense of possibility and responsibility. It is essential that we offer the opportunity of travel to today's students. True, many schools have programs abroad, but as far as I can determine, most of those programs simply locate the home-brewed curriculum in a new setting, while assuming that students living abroad will experience a different culture in their off hours. Cafe culture is not simply good enough. Foreign travel for architecture students should be structured not as classroom or studio time in another land, but as the first-hand experience of those places in their full and frequently contradictory variety. There is nothing more valuable in architectural education than the intense encounter, shared encounter, of student and teacher and place. Students need first-hand experience guided by knowing teachers who in situ can introduce unfamiliar ideas from non-modern and especially non-Western cultures. Students and recent graduates also need to be encouraged to intern in foreign practices, and our American schools need to reach out to attract as many qualified international students as possible from all parts of the world. To prepare architects for their place in global practice, which is inevitable to us in this century, the student composition of our schools must become cosmopolitan. Of course, it would also it would help if our students were forced to master a foreign language. A shocking lack in today's architectural education, not to mention American education as a whole. Barring that turn of events, at the very least, I would settle for our students learning how to speak and write their own native English with a reasonable degree of precision. Sustainability is an important, but also, I'm afraid to say, is cliche-prone buzzword in contemporary practice. Each of us is aware of the perilous state our planet is in today, largely as the result of our amazing material progress. Architects are confronted with opportunities to work at vast scales, to conceive huge buildings requiring tremendous resources in terms of both materials and labor, buildings that suck up an awful lot of energy. But to dismiss these buildings as irresponsible, as is frequently done, is not fair or accurate. For many of them are ingenious in their use of advanced technology, applying advanced technology to modify the extremes of climate and make parts of the world previously inhabited by very few in primitive circumstances truly habitable. Despite the perils they have imposed on the planet, we cannot overlook the fact that a large part of the world's population enjoys a higher standard of living today than ever before as a result of our technological progress. Yet we architects are not yet taking the leadership in using architecture to mitigate environmental problems. For example, aided and abetted by the media, we remain comfortably object fixated and woefully ignorant of the relationship of buildings to land. In my student days, there was a lot of talk about vernacular architecture, but the simple buildings of the pre-industrial past were aestheticized rather than analyzed in relationship to local geographies, climates, and materials that shaped them. Today, that was what I would call the Museum of Modern Art view of primitive architecture. You remember, architecture without architects, but they were really hoping for architecture without, and getting rid of both the architects and the architecture at the time, and we would all build mud huts. Today, we need to look at vernacular architecture not only as a means of enriching formal vocabularies, but also as a standard for measuring environmental performance. We need also to find ways to unite the two architectures, that of the land and that of buildings, which have for too long operated in parallel but seldom in tandem. As the architectural critic A. Louise Huxtable has observed, landscape architects and not building architects seem to be showing the way in re-engaging development with human needs and social functions, while architects, she writes, quote, seduced by celebrity and technology, engage in a dead-end contest of egos and engineering, becoming more fixated on object-making than place-making, more removed from the intrinsic social purposes of their art. The renewed vitality of landscape architecture reaffirms one's belief, Huxtable states, that art can still be a generous and redeeming public art. Architecture can still be a generous, I should say. I think Huxtable has it right. Regrettably, most schools of architecture offer no meaningful lecture or studio courses in the field of landscape architecture. And those schools that have programs in architecture and landscape architecture are usually so siloed by virtue of differing requirements for professional certification, not to mention egos of faculty, that there is virtually no interdisciplinary crossover between the two. As my Yale colleague Joel Sanders stated in a recent colloquium, this professional segregation mirrors long-standing Western conceptions about the relationship between nature and architecture, which have been seen as antagonistic entities. by demonizing, he says, mankind, and in particular builders and architects, as seeing them as villains responsible for pillaging the pristine order of nature, nature and culture have been rendered as hostile enemies. But the environmental crisis, and I continue to quote Sanders, that we confront requires us to readjust these deep-seated and now outmoded preconceptions. Rather than pit one against the other, we need to recognize that nature and culture are always independent. And if we align deep-rooted preconceptions, he goes on, and conceive of nature and culture as a web of interconnected forces, sustainable principles have the potential to radically alter professional practice today. In short, green design promises to be a catalyst for creativity, not for putting solar panels on roofs. Asked to talk about architectural education, I have tried to do so by examining its core nature as a discipline and pointing to some specific things that need to be addressed, as I see it, in order to better prepare students for their place in the evolving profession. For myself as teacher and practitioner, I have steadfastly refused to exclusively embrace this or that system. Some have said that as a result I have no point of view, that I am an eclectic. But in approaching my work as an architect, historian, and educator, I stand with the French poet Émile Auguste Chartier-Alain, who proclaimed, "Nothing's more dangerous than an idea when you only have one." The purpose of architectural education is to introduce students to the broad map of the discipline of architecture, a map with many roads. Education must celebrate talent in all its diversity. It must liberate minds. Young architects need to be exposed to new ideas, which may come from the morning's newspaper, from the past, or from technological advances. Most of all, young architects must be encouraged to embrace debate, even disagreement. Differences must be respected. There are no rights or wrongs in art. In my student days, I was torn between the disciplines of research and practice, between the authority of the past and the adventure of the future. Despite the example of Paul Rudolph in the studio and Vincent Scully in the lecture hall, I and very many of my classmates were convinced our obligation was to invent a new architecture if we were to be of any consequence as architects. We sadly and ignorantly believed that Le Corbusier's polemical book was correctly titled Towards a New Architecture, when in fact that title was a mistranslation by an Englishman from the French, Vers une architecture, which urged readers toward an architecture that Le Corbusier insisted had to measure up to the lessons of the past as it embraced the challenges of the present. Architecture must be rooted in the dialogue and architectural education of the past with the present. Almost 40 years ago, Vincent Scully, in the volume 910 of Perspective, the Yale Architectural Journal, defined modern architecture in relationship to modern life and our task as architects, perhaps better than anyone else I know. In Perspective, Professor Scully wrote that, quote, "We are obliged to open eyes and minds in all our fields, beyond the individual building, the true scale of architecture, which is that of all structures in relationship to each other and to the land, is now opening before us. From now on, it can never be anything less. All this is hard on us. There will constantly be those who seek to close up our minds again, ourselves in fatigue among them. There will especially be those who seek to separate the word from the thing, valuing neither. But it is all one and divine. We must open it now to all." I thank Professor Scully for all that he has done for me and for architecture. And again, thank you for the great honor of the Scully Prize and for the honor you place upon me by this lecture. As I depart this platform, or at least the podium part of it, I offer one last caution. Architecture is not a religion. It has no dogma. Architecture is the art of the possible, and each of us who cares about the environment has an obligation to contribute to its evolution. As we are architects, we struggle to serve the public good and all our humanity. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ned Kramer, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Architect Magazine, as well as one of the members of this year's Scully Prize committee. And it's my honor to have been invited by the National Building Museum to chat for a bit with Bob Stern and begin to bring the dialogue away from the podium and into the collective. So I'll begin with a few questions for you, and then we'll kind of roll out and invite members of the audience to speak. We have 2 microphones set up on either side of the room, so you can come up and ask your questions there. Bob, you know, your whole lecture really kind of hinged on what Bruce Mao describes as massive change. You know, this sort of unavoidable sense that in this moment, the game is just completely different. You know, I think one of the most powerful things to me about your 10 years at Yale, is your introduction into a highly modernist-derived curriculum, your sort of reintroduction of history and tradition, not only in the sense that Professor Scully has taught it, but also to the studio. That was a pretty revolutionary thing for you to have done 10 years ago. I mean, I remember people talking about it, you know, some clutching the pearls, you know, in shock.
Biting of nails is more the case.
Yes. So do you think 10 years later that perceived tension between history and tradition and innovation and progress is even germane?
Say that again?
Do you think that you know, that kind of sense of we have history in one camp and tradition, and we have innovation in the other, and modernism, do people even care anymore? I mean, they were such opposing camps.
Well, I can't speak for all the schools of architecture or all the practices around the country. I would say that what we've done at Yale, which I take a reasonable, modest credit for in the last 10 years, but it's not exactly brand new to the way things have been done at Yale. Certain leading figures like Tom Beebe, the dean before, 2 deans before, certainly is a person who I think shares many of these ideas, if not all. And Leon Creer and Dimitri Porphyrios and others were teaching in the studios. I just maybe got them to come more often and let them do more of what they wanted to do.
Right.
But I can't say that what we've done at Yale has exactly revolutionized the curriculum of American architecture, though I think they could take a few notes from us, sure. It sounds arrogant, but of course the president of Yale said last night that I was a bit. We've got a pretty good thing going, and I'm supported by my faculty, and I'm supported by the way the school is structured and by the university. Last night, Michael Eisner talked very nicely. When he was the head of Disney, people said, "Oh, Mr. Eisner, when you leave, the company will be changed." And he said, "No. Whoever's running the place sets the agenda." And so I can't predict what will happen, and I don't know what other schools will happen, but I do believe what I said tonight is something worth considering by the people who are responsible for schools across the country, plus the people who are responsible for setting standards for architectural education. I don't want to turn this into a boring AIA seminar, but you know, we do determine, it is a professional organization, and we do determine what a proper education for architects is. And, you know, let's face it, most times architects sit at a table with lawyers and engineers, and particularly in the international scene. They are so educated, so well-read, so articulate, and then comes the architect, and he doesn't even know when George Washington was president, practically. It's unbelievable. It's embarrassing, frankly. So I offer you my slightly crabby old man's view, but
we love it.
Take it to heart.
Nice. So do you sense a difference, given the kind of moment of change that we're living through? Do you sense a difference in the students themselves? I see, you know, you spoke passionately about the computer for instance, and its potentially adverse effects on students' understanding of scale and tectonics and so forth. But aren't students, they're not just learning about the computer in architecture school, aren't they also really arriving at architecture school as digital natives who already kind of think in a certain way, you know, sort of with their PDAs attached to their hips?
Well, I think they arrive about knowing how to do YouTube,
Yeah.
and they know how to do lots of things on the computer, but to become an architect is a different thing, a different way of learning. I mean, it is, the irony is about our way of teaching, country at least, that architects are totally, or often decide to become, students decide to become architects on the basis of no real pre-existing thing. But I don't want to talk about the computer. I think I made my point.
Yeah.
But I will make my point in another way. Can you imagine a music student at Juilliard or the Yale School of Music or anywhere else who A, can't play a couple of instruments, 2, doesn't know the literature of music from medieval music and so forth, and maybe some exotic, that is to say non-Western tradition as well, who can't handwrite on a music and take notation? No, there is no musician, whether he or she is intending to be a performer or a composer, is that way. How can we produce a great architecture when we are so self-denying as to our own traditions and our own ways of making things? So we just have to do it a different way. And if Yale is the only place that's going to do it, mark my words, our graduates are going to be running the place.
So, you know, another question. You spoke a great deal about cosmopolitanism, very long word. And my sense was that in many cases you were addressing issues of globalism, what we would call globalism today. What's the difference between globalism and cosmopolitanism?
Well, globalism is the condition we're all faced. That is, tomorrow half the architects in this room, if they're lucky, will be on an airplane to Dubai, right, where their projects haven't yet collapsed. But cosmopolitanism is a question of when they are working in these countries, how closely or how deeply are they digging into the local ways of doing things, or making connections to Morocco or other more, shall we say, non-nomadic cultures that have dealt with the same kinds of climates and the same religious traditions and so forth, and incorporating it. That is not to say putting a funny top on a skyscraper, but there are skyscrapers that look like they made an effort to deal with the local tradition, and there are others that look like they could have been built literally anywhere. And we have to be very careful. We are being, as the most advanced culture at the moment, we are being often hired to bring, to export something that is totally alien to the place, to help to jumpstart that place and bring it into the new world, the Western world. But that's very short range. You can see the signs of that. So the next step is to be asked to come to really show people how to build their own way in their own place. Traditions they may have lost, we can help them discover.
Well, and you spoke about the vernacular, which I thought was very interesting as a kind of potential touchstone for what we now call sustainability. When I was curator at the Chicago Architecture Foundation and I was asked to kind of explain what a sustainable building might look like, I often referred to buildings of the late 19th century in Chicago, buildings like the Rookery, with the central light well that promoted natural air circulation and light circulation. You spoke of, when you spoke the vernacular, I think more of pre-industrial buildings.
Yes, I was talking about that, but I think you're absolutely right to say that I wouldn't call the Rookery vernacular. I would just say
exactly.
It was designed in that period where technology allowed people to build many floors, things like that, steel construction, but still you had to rely on natural ventilation. It's a very complicated issue, but one needs to realize that the problems cannot simply be solved by simply referring to the moment. And that there are examples, typologies, and things that have been learned before. I mean, Patrick Bellew teaches sustainability courses in environmentalism at Yale, head of Atelier 10. He always says, well, people come to me and say, how can I make my glass building, my skyscraper, environmentally responsible? And he always says, first question answer he gives him is, have you thought of not cladding it in glass? And of course, can you not? I don't know. But, the Rookery, courtyards, skylights, Rudolph's building, which we just rededicated. He originally wanted the well to go all the way through. He he was very concerned with how air moved through the art and architecture building. His ideas got shortchanged, but even the buildings that are being threatened of Rudolph's to be torn down in Florida, they are amazing buildings for natural ventilation, the high schools I'm referring to. Why do they want to tear them down? Because they want air-conditioned high schools,
Right.
which is not Rudolph's fault. Rudolph's genius was to make buildings that worked in the climate. So you need to know about that. We need to look back, and we need to ask ourselves hard questions, and we need to know where to draw certain lines from time to time in the sand and say, this is wrong, you have to try it this way. A lot of our architectural colleagues are not so good at sand drawing.
Very good. Speaking of lines in the sand, I think it might be a good moment to extend the line out to include the audience. Does anyone have a question for Bob Stern? And if so, please come on up to one of the microphones.
Fast.
Great.
Oh, I thought I'd answered everybody's question. That was my dream.
You're not done yet.
Thank you so much. Bob, thank you so much for this most inspiring lecture on architectural education. I think it might be nice to also remind our audience that in 1986, you became a star of the small screen when you produced a wonderful series, Pride of Place, that was an education for your fellow architect colleagues in the profession, but also for teachers and students of architecture. And I myself at Virginia Tech organized, in fact, a whole course that was based on that wonderful series. And my question to you is this: I think the time is ripe for a sequel. And if you were to think of that, what might be the themes that you would then include in a sequel for Pride of Place?
Oh, well, that's very nice of you to think that there should be a sequel. My critics would have said enough was enough. And I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I'm not dodging your question. I just don't know what it would be. But the themes that, the truth of the matter is Pride of Place was not conceived for architects. I was happy that architects watched it. It was really conceived to talk to the public. A vast number of people in the public who are not architects are very interested in architecture, but are so completely intimidated by architalk and fancy words. Every profession has its jargon, but we really have a lot of it. And to try to get them to say, "Oh, this building, oh, I love the White House. It's a work of architecture," you know, and not just the White House or whatever building it was. So anything that people can do to communicate with the public at large and make them feel more comfortable with the fact that what we as architects do is the framework, the physical framework of their lives. I would say we could do more about towns and cities than certainly I did then, and certainly than I did tonight. I would have loved to have talked more tonight about what we should do in schools to teach or to imbue students with urbanism. I hate to keep going back to Rudolph, but why not? He was a great teacher. He said, you know, the one-off building that stands by itself, that's nice, but the real problem with modern architecture is the fabric of the city. Background buildings. No, you never have heard a student get up and say, I want to design a background building. Each one wants to do whatever it is, the Bilbao, the AMA, whatever the hot foreground building is. But most of us need to learn how to do background buildings. And now, the media, conjoined with the development community, has gotten hot on architecture in a certain way. Maybe it's cooling down, but it was. And developers don't want to do background buildings. They want to turn their 30-story condo into the Bilbao with windows, you know? It's crazy. It's crazy. So maybe that conversation about how a city is a conversation of foreground and background, how you make spaces. And again, Rudolph always talked about Camillo Sitta's book, The Art of Building Cities. And he would bring into the studio a book, some of you may know, the American Civic Art book by Werner Hegemann and Elbert Pietz. And he would just sit and show you plans of squares and towns from antiquity well into the Beaux-Arts period. And he would just say, that's what we need to be making. That's how you need to think about your project. So if one could convey that way of thinking about architecture, and it's good to ask that question I'm rattling on a bit, but in Washington, people say, oh, Washington has so many dull government buildings. I'm never bored in Washington. I think there's some dull ones and some interesting ones, but the spaces they make, the mall, the avenues, the transformation even of Pennsylvania Avenue into this great street with not all equally good buildings, but still, that's what we need to do to go forward in architecture and spend less time on the object fixation. The other, I suppose, to rattle on a bit more, is the point of landscape architecture and architecture, and how the land is not just a garden, although gardens are beautiful and important, but it's much more architectural problem, that the shaping of the surface of the earth in relationship to activities of man on it, under it, and above it is very important. So there it is. Now we need to revive the Petroleum Broadcasting Network, which is what system, which is what PBS was called in those days, and spend unbelievable amounts of money to get some guy with yellow socks to go on television.
Nice. David, do you have a question?
Yeah, Bob, have you been able to instill in your students at Yale, the same love of history and interest in history and the same interest in hand drawing that you espouse here on the stage tonight? And if so, how did you do it? And if not, why not?
First of all, when I arrived at Yale as a dean, already there was in place a seminar, an elective seminar where students would go with a teacher to Rome for 3 weeks in the summer and draw. They could bring their camera, but they couldn't, but their photographs were their private business. Everything was notebooks and then a project at the end. 2 years into that, my deanship, the students came to me and said, taught by a beloved teacher, Alec Purvis, many of you may know him, and Stephen Harvey, a younger graduate of the school. They came and said, you know, the course is too short. We can't get enough out of it. We want another week. And a good half of it's confined to students who are in the next to last year of school, second year in other words, and a good half of the class elect to do it. Frankly, all of the class would elect to do it, but it's a money problem. So I have no problem, and we have a drawing class every year. It's required. We try different formulas, but it's been taught at Yale forever. And it's required. Every student from Yale actually does know how to draw. In my day, they only knew how to talk. I will admit that, but now know how to draw. I think history, students are very interested in history. The Saarinen show, which we had here at the Building Museum, traveling around the world, if you examine the catalog, you will see many Yale student names who willingly and enthusiastically participated in it. They hunger, intelligent young people hunger to know that there's something behind what they do. They're not just drawing little pictures. And I think that this is not just Yale. This is surely other schools and other places. But, you know, I immodestly say, how could I not say with Vincent Scully on the faculty and even this term David Schwartz, Yale is a pretty privileged place. But one of the things about the conversation that doesn't make clear in the talk, but because we are able to bring so many different people at any given time from different parts of the profession to Yale at once, and you can see in one studio David Schwartz doing Las Vegas with a developer, you can see Leon Creer doing another, and whatever, as you move around, Greg Lynn and so forth. You are made immediately aware as student, faculty, and even the visitors are reminded that their point of view, however established and august it is not the only one. And it's amazing to watch Zaha Hadid and Dimitri Porphyrios, who never talk to each other in London, to say the least, sit down and talk. And then it turns out that Dimitri Porphyrios was Zaha Hadid's tutor at the AA. Go figure that one out. Yeah. But we get ourselves into our narrow ways of thinking, and students of all groups, students should not be allowed to do that. Certainly they should be discouraged from that. And they will figure it out. Any student with anything to offer will figure out what's right and wrong for him or herself eventually. But we need to give them the choices. We need to give them the vocabulary of ideas, and the scaffolding of ideas, if you will.
Sir?
As a graduate of the Harvard Business School, I'm a great fan of your Spangler Center, and both for the traditional design and respect for the rest of the campus, also the quality of its execution. But when I offer it as an example to architects, including some quite distinguished ones as a non-architect, I find they often decry it, and in some cases very condescending about it. And wonder what it is about the psyche of architects, and perhaps the way that they're educated, trained, and even practiced that produces such a response, and what it is in the culture that could change that.
Well, I can't answer that. If I could, I'd get more work. But I think that partially it's their education, and that's why I'm addressing, much as I grumbled about being asked to do this particular topic, once I got into it, I thought, Mike, it's quite interesting, important. Partially it's their education. They're taught to believe that that which is continues a language from the past is automatically second class, which there's no evidence in the history of art that that is true. Vincent Scully could better answer this question, I am sure, than I could ever hope to, but it's built into this culture of the tradition of the avant-garde, the tradition of the new, as the new is always better and has to be different from everything that went before. But we find in the world of painting and sculpture, but say painting, there are artists today who are really enjoying a considerable éclat among the critical establishment, good or bad that might be, and who are working in modes of expression that go back very, very far into the past and are reformulating how they're using it and going forward. And the greatest artist, painter of the 20th century, certainly one of them at least, Picasso, constantly revisited the work of previous artists and went forward with it. So there is really I have no problem with what I do. The profession may indeed have a problem, but they, of course, will only mumble about it privately. And I go even further. In England, there is a roiling debate at the moment, which is that traditional architects, and there are many, like Robert Adam and others, who are really superb architects with large and successful and clearly defined practices, who are excluded from the conversation and even virtually ignored and derided by the professional organization, the Royal Institute of British Architects. That is absolutely wrong. It's exactly the kind of thing that we must fight. And I've, inspired by my teachers, I've fought that all along. So I don't know. I think, what can I say? I think Harvard was great to hire me to do that building and another one, and I'm trying to get a third in case you know about it. So don't hesitate to call the dean.
Yes.
Bob, you mentioned earlier that people would think it ridiculous if someone showed up to a music college without having picked up an instrument. Yet that's happening in schools of architecture. What would you do to encourage an exploration of the built environment for K through 12 audience before they get to you for the future architects, clients, and users?
Well, I know that the Building Museum, this is the plug for the Building Museum, has wonderful programs for children, although I am not totally familiar with them. But I don't know how many times an architect or an architectural historian or architecture or architectural history are introduced into the active curriculum in the classroom side by side with other things. It shouldn't be an away game, in my view. You teach, we don't do enough in this country to teach the arts in our K through high school systems. It's not just, but every student finger paints and whatever. Of course, they ought to be told that finger painting is hideous, and they ought to try to discipline themselves to learn how to draw. Civilized people for hundreds, maybe thousands of years learned how to draw, to look at a thing and to put it down on paper. There's nothing embarrassing about that. But Freudian psychology and all that ruined it, and so now my son came home with drawings that were hideous. And his teacher said that he was criticizing all the other drawings in the class. I said, he was right and she was right, but they all were terrible. Why not learn how to draw? Why not learn how to see? Why not learn how to look? It's not to make people play with blocks or do that. It's to make people see the world around them. I know that Vincent Scully, and I don't know if he still does it, but at the beginning of his class to Yale undergraduates who come from all disciplines, not architects. He makes them go to East Rock and stand on the top of the rock and look out over the landscape of the city and the water beyond and see what they see. Make a drawing, not write a paper. Make a drawing. I think that's fine. Ruskin did it. Norton did it at Harvard. We've lost that tradition, and that's how we should do it, and we shouldn't just wait till they're freshmen or sophomores in a college, but we should start it early. So if you want to change the culture, that's how you have to change it. And most of you have children or grandchildren. I'm sure you're all dreaming of them taking piano lessons or violin lessons or whatever so they can get into Yale. How about taking drawing lessons? What's wrong with that? My case is rested.
Yes, I think that's a great note to end the evening on. I want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you, Bob Stern, for your words of wisdom.